Today, we start looking at the book of 2 Timothy. Kathy offered me a choice of passages, and I actually chose this passage because it talks about Paul missing and fondly remembering Timothy. It struck a chord with me because I fondly remember the time we as a family spent with you all here in Chatherton, and we miss you all very much. My children grew up in this church, and many of you had a hand in encouraging them in their faith, for which we're so enormously grateful. Part of my job today is to introduce you to the book of 2 Timothy. This is St. Paul's second letter to his young apprentice Timothy. So the kind of things we're going to find in this book as we look at it together are the kind of things that an old and wise teacher might say to his student before a final exam. It's probably Paul's very last letter, and certainly has the feel of the author winding down and wanting to pass on the most important things that he's learned, passing on the baton to the next generation. It contains sentiments such as, "I've worked hard, now it's your turn," and "remember all that you've learned." So who was Timothy? Well, he was half Jew and half Greek. He lived in a Roman town called Lystra in present-day Turkey and became a Christian as a teenager, probably by hearing Paul preach when he first visited. When Paul came back a few years later, he commissioned Timothy to be part of his mission team and took him with him on his travels. From then on, Timothy was Paul's apprentice and eventually his natural successor, ending up being the bishop of Ephesus and probably dying there for his faith. I know it's rare these days, with emails, texts, WhatsApps and electronic messages of all kinds, but receiving a personal handwritten letter is actually a very special thing. Before the internet, yes, there was a time before the internet, I used to love sending letters. I sent all sorts of funny letters. Once, I wrote a whole letter on the outside of an apple, stuck a stamp on it, and popped it in the post. My poor recipient was woken up by the postman who couldn't get it through letterbox. Think back to a time when you received a handwritten letter from someone special. What was the motive for your friend writing the letter? Generally, the author of a letter wants your attention. They want to tell you something important. Many such letters are written because the sender cares about the recipient and wants you to feel loved and valued. They usually want to encourage you. I think that's why Paul is writing to Timothy. It's so personal, so sensitive. "I long to see you again, for I remember your tears as we parted, and I will be filled with joy when we are together again." Paul clearly cares for Timothy and really wants to encourage him in his faith. How important encouragement is. Do you know, there's so many times that I think of encouraging someone, and for some reason, I don't. And then afterwards, the moment has gone, and I regret it. Yet, it's such an easy thing to do. Do you do enough of it? What stops you from encouraging people? Is there any reason why we shouldn't encourage others? To be honest, I struggle to think of any reasons. If it's good enough for St. Paul, then I think it's good enough for us. In his letter, Paul gives us a real insight into how to encourage a younger Christian. This is essentially discipleship. He reminds Timothy of what God has done in his life. Isn't that so important? Recently, I had been reminded that many years previously, God had miraculously intervened and fixed one of our client's servers. So I shared the story in our morning prayer meeting at work, as not everyone in that meeting had been there when it happened. To my surprise, one of the longer standing members of staff piped up after I'd shared that God had done a very similar thing with another client too. He recounted that when his office in London had been broken into and his computer had been stolen, the only backup that we had of the data turned out to be corrupt. We tried everything, but we couldn't get any of the data back. It was a total disaster. And in desperation, at my wit's end, I rang the office, and over the phone, we prayed earnestly together as a staff team that God would intervene. I tried the backup disk again after we finished the prayer, and you know what? It sprang back into life. I share this story for your encouragement that God is amazing, isn't he? But also to illustrate an important point. I had actually forgotten about that incident. Can you believe that? Something so important in my life. But by sharing one encouraging story with my staff, they reminded me of another. Friends, let's encourage each other with what God has done in our lives. Let's not forget what he's done, as it's so easy to do. And let's not neglect the opportunity we have to encourage each other, encourage a fellow believer when they do a good thing. It's so easy these days to send a message of some kind, to say, well done, God really used you there. Before I move on from encouragement, just a special mention about encouraging the younger generation. Paul here is encouraging his younger disciple. He also mentions Timothy's mother and grandmother. Might it be that this mighty man of God, who helped Paul write some of the letters that would become our Bible, might be a Christian in part because of the witness and love of his mother and grandmother? Timothy's dad, you see, was not a Christian. He was a Greek and was clearly opposed to the faith of his mother because Timothy wasn't circumcised as a child. Most unusual. Be encouraged, all of you who have family members who aren't involved in the church or are even opposed. Your family and your encouragement might make all the difference to a youngster trying to make sense of the world. Also, one way of encouraging younger Christians is to give them responsibility, even if we are not sure that they have the ability yet. Paul was not a lone worker, as many have imagined. He always rounded up a team on each mission and included the young Timothy before he had had much experience. Paul expected him to learn on the job. Why do we hesitate to give our youngsters a chance? Are we afraid of failure? Are we fearful that they'll give the wrong impression, say the wrong things, mess up the church? But isn't it God who is to be relied on, not the youngsters? Are we any more able to do things ourselves, or do we rely on God? Let me ask you this, which is worse, failure or the fear of failure? The fear of failure often stops us investing in others. God uses our failures as a way of teaching us. And isn't that how young people will learn? Dear friends, we need to encourage our young people by investing in them, giving them chances to do things that they might not be capable of doing just yet, and be there for them, to pray with them, help them, and remind them that they should be relying on God's strength and not their own. Moving on, second point. For those of you that know me, you know I have a passion. Wood burning. I love it. Any wood burner will tell you that all you need to start a fire is a really small flame and the right conditions. In fact, with really dry kindling, just a spark will set it going and you'll end up with a roaring blaze. Sometimes, however, the fuel is damp or there isn't enough small material which catches light easily. Often the fire will struggle and smoulder. It could be touch and go. It might go out or it might take. It's at these times that you need to take action. You need a bellows. With one of these and enough effort, you can basically get a blazing inferno out of useless bits of old damp scrap. When I was a child, my father used to go one step further. He always used to leave lighting the barbecue until the very last minute. And Mum wanted to cook on it long before it was ready. So he used a hairdryer. Sometimes his enthusiasm would get the better of him and all that'd be left for cooking was hot ash. Anyway, I digress. It's the same with us. Sometimes in our lives, we're on fire for God. But other times, we really struggle. The conditions seem against us. We're so busy, aren't we? Money can be tight. Health issues, my back, really plague our lives. And it's so much easier to sink in front of the telly and forget about life. Yet, you know, God has given us all good gifts. Every single one of us is good at something. We all have interests and passions. As Christians, we've all been given the Holy Spirit, which is the source of all good things and all power. All power. God has given us the tools we need to do his work. It's up to us to decide to use them. Okay, stop listening to me for a sec and have a think about what your gifts are. What gifts has God given you? You might have many gifts, or you might just have one, but no matter, just take a few seconds to think about them and decide which is your most useful or strongest gift. Go. Tricky, isn't it? Okay, question 2. Are you using that gift to build God's kingdom? Building God's kingdom, by the way, can be anything that God might want you to do, not just church. Right. I hope that your last answer was yes, at least in part. Well, this verse tells us to fan into flame the gift that God has given you. That means not just using it every now and again, once a week or once a month, but to fan into flame. Be on fire for God. Question 3 is this. Are you using your gift enough? And could you use it more? God has given you a gift to use for his kingdom. Well, then we should be using it to the max. But I don't have time, you might say. I'm too busy. Maybe. But maybe we're doing the wrong things. Are there some things that we need to put down in order to make time for the thing God actually wants us to be doing? We can't do everything, and nor should we be expected to do so. But if he's specifically given us a gift, then surely we should be using it rather than struggling to do things that we're not actually gifted at. One more note before I move on from gifts, because there are so many things that could be said. Just allow me one more. A popular theme with St. Paul is the idea of striving or working at something, much like an athlete trains for a race. You know, this is so true of our gifts. We need to get exercise in using our gifts. And it may be that they're only a small spark to begin with and need to be fanned hard to make them into a flame or even a fire. Don't be discouraged if we don't first succeed with our gifts. The example of an athlete is actually a good one. Even if you are good at running, it's unlikely that you could run a marathon tomorrow without some sort of preparation first. In order to run a marathon, you need to start training. Start small, 5 minutes running each on the first day, 10 minutes on the second day, and so on. And soon you'll be doing an hour a day, but still need more practice to do long runs at weekends before you can run a marathon. So it is with God. God actually wants to teach us through the process of preparation. We often learn much more from practice sessions than from the actual race. We shouldn't be afraid of failure either. Many of our first tries, if not all, might not produce the result we wanted or expected. But this is important. Failure is a way of God teaching us to trust him. After all, his power is made perfect through our weakness. My last point. That brings me on to my last point, which is about fear. In verse 7, Paul urges Timothy not to be afraid to use his gift. His language is very strong. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. Unhealthy fear is almost the opposite of faith, I think. Faith is believing and trusting in a God of miracles who can overcome anything, any obstacle. Jesus says, nothing is impossible with God. Yet fear is a very natural part of our lives. And there is a healthy kind of fear. The kind of fear that stops us from getting hurt by snakes or fire or a vehicle coming towards us on the wrong side of the road. And remember that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Paul isn't talking about that kind of fear in this verse. Fear becomes unhealthy when we allow our fears to frighten us and take hold of our lives. If we allow fear to fester and we don't deal with it, then we don't do good things that God wants us to do because we are afraid. We are frightened of all sorts of things, aren't we? Pain, the fear of being rejected or laughed at, cancer or COVID, the fear of failure. Some people are even afraid of the dark or spiders. The fear of death is actually quite scary. I'm actually afraid of dentists. Even though even the thought of going to the dentist makes me short of breath and my heart starts pumping more quickly than normal. In fact, I'm actually a very anxious person. I don't seem to have control over it either. Believe me, I've really tried. When I get anxious, I can't eat or concentrate on things, and I have difficulty sleeping. Before exams, I used to have to pace around, just walk up and down. I couldn't do anything else constructive until exam had started. So what does the Bible offer us to help with our fears and anxieties? Let me first say, I don't think there's a quick fix. Humans haven't got a hidden switch somewhere that can turn fear and anxiety off. Secondly, I think it is important that we are honest with each other and before God about our fears. There is no point pretending that we're not afraid. It doesn't help. It doesn't help us and doesn't help those around us who might actually be fearful too and would feel even worse if they thought they were the only ones who were afraid. The Bible talks a great deal about fear. And you know, all the characters in the Bible encounter fear. The Psalms is bursting with prayer, asking God to help with fear. Psalm 56, verse 3, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Psalm 55, 22, give your burdens to the Lord, and he will take care of you. This is reflected in the New Testament as well. 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And finally, John 16:33, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Do you know, just saying these verses makes me feel better. It calms me right down and quietens my soul. I recently had to drive to Scotland and back for work and decided to listen to the Psalms in my car. Do you know, I got all the way up to over Psalm 100 and something or other. And when I got back to Manchester, I was chilled as a frozen cucumber. I was absolutely taken aback at the difference it had made to my state of mind. You see, part of the problem here is believing the lies of the enemy. Jesus, in John 8:44, calls him the father of lies. Satan's lies are his most effective weapon. And how do we combat these lies? Well, learning, believing, and retaining the truths of the Bible. That's how. Satan says we have no hope and we need to be afraid because we are going to face big trouble. The truth is, we are going to face big trouble, but God is with us and he's already won the victory. If God is for us, who can stand against us? The enemy says, don't bother because you can't make a difference. The truth is, God has given us gifts because he wants us to make a difference. Why would he give us gifts if we couldn't use them to make a difference? Jesus says in the parable of the sower that people who hear the word, retain it, and by persevering produce a crop 100 times more than was sown. I reckon 100 times more than was sown is quite a difference, don't you? Take heart and be courageous, my friends, because the Lord hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, love, and self-discipline. So when I finish, let me just summarize my 3 points. We need to encourage each other. Let's not hold back from saying well done and sharing stories of what God has done. We all have gifts that God has given us. Let us use those gifts to the max. Let's go for it, using our gifts to build each other up and to serve as Christ served us. And finally, be bold, be strong, and be courageous, because God is with us and he's doing all the hard work. We just need to trust him and follow his lead.